o'clock.
In the middle.
Sorry. We're filming, so in case those of you who weren't here for the, when Vivian said it before, you can keep your comments that you don't want on tape down, because otherwise they will be picked up. We would appreciate that. We are very fortunate today to have Greg Thaler, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
And Cindy Tolan, both from Denver Options. We consider them some of the experts in the field on executive functioning. When I first heard about that we should do a thing on executive functioning, I thought it was for the executives to learn how to function better, which you might need that training. I think you can do that. But so obviously these people are going to tell us a lot, and it'll be great. As I told him, we have a lot of supervisors and therapists here, so I'll have some good interaction and dialogue.
Thanks, Becky.
Thanks for coming.
Good afternoon. How we doing?
Good.
Great.
Do we all have a packet?
Yes.
Any of us need a packet? We all good to go? Some of them are white, and others are clear. Maize color, I guess. Do we all have a pencil or pen? I'm going to ask you to do a few things from your seat. Do we all have a pencil or a pen?
Yeah. Anyway, no, we're good. You need a writing pencil?
Well, as Becky so expertly indicated, we're not here to talk about the behavior of our CEO today, although again that may be a future presentation topic. We're here to talk about executive functioning. How many of us are familiar with the term and the implications, the real-life consequences of executive functioning? Is that a word that's in all of our vocabulary, or most of ours? Okay, well, good. Good that we're going to spend the next couple of hours together talking about executive function. As you see, as I tend to do when I make a presentation, I brought some of my toys from the office. These would be neuropsychological assessments, of course, and we look, of course, at assessing various aspects of our client's executive functioning, whether it be their ability to form concepts or multitask information, that sort of thing. Any questions, comments, discussion before we kick things off today? Okay. If you look on our fee sheet here, our colleague Beth Peterson regretfully was not able to join us today, so it will be Cindy and I carrying on in Beth's absence. Let's take a look at your packets for a moment. The big packet, Executive Functioning, Learning Self-Management, that's printed on both sides. We wanted to get as much, hopefully, helpful information in as few pages and fill as few trees as we could. Go ahead and leaf through that information. Just take a minute to do that if you could. So kind of give you a flavor for what we're going to be talking about today. I would say all of our information in the packet is self-explanatory, and there will probably be things today that we don't get to, which is always okay, because you can go ahead and use the handouts for future references. Cindy and I would appreciate a little guidance, a little input from all of you in terms of, do we want to be a little more on the hands-on side today, looking at real-life executive function strategies to assist our clients with their personal empowerment? Would you like a little more theoretical brain kind of stuff? Do we have any, or a little of both? What are our preferences today? What would be the best learning experience?
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both? Because we're certainly flexible. We have more than enough material to cover today. So, all right. If you look on the right side of your packet, you'll see something called a Trails A and a Trails B. That's a little measure of executive function that we will all do from our seats. And there is also a self-assessment of our personal executive function issues. Hopefully that's not going to be too big of a hoop for us. That self-assessment looks at various aspects of executive function, and you'll be able to identify relative strengths or some issues in your own personal executive function if you so choose. So we'll do that exercise together from our seats. And also there's packets of information on strategies to empower various aspects of executive function, such as behavior programs, teaching curriculum, that sort of thing, in the final several packets of information. Shall we get to it? Okay. Am I coming through loud and clear okay on the mic and everything? All right. Well, probably among the first theorists to look at what we now call executive function would be the one, the only, the famous or infamous Sigmund Freud. Do I hear any boos and hisses from the audience?
Yes.
Those will probably come out pretty good on the tape. Now me, of course, I'm probably going to have to do some self-monitoring, which is an important executive function skill. I'm going to have to inhibit my tendency to wander around a bit and try to stay in front of the lens. Self-monitoring, of course, inhibiting a favorite response are both important executive function skills as well. And I will try to do my best to demonstrate good executive function today. Freud, of course, his model of personality, his theory of psychosexual development, looked at the expression of our sexual and aggressive impulses. Would this be better? No. We recall Freud's model consisting of ego, superego, and id. Matter of fact, when we administer Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, MMPI-2, when we administer MMPI-2 to our clients, there is a supplemental scale called Ego Strength that those of us who are familiar with MMPI-2 may be familiar with. Briefly, we recall that id is that wild, hedonistic, primary process, impulsive side, let it all hang out. If I think it, I want it. And it's very impulsive. It doesn't want to take turns, doesn't want to share, doesn't want to wait in line. Matter of fact, id, if left unchecked, would knock people down to get to the front of the line. It's our inborn survival instinct, if you will, the source of our sexual and aggressive impulses. And Freud's entire model of personality involves the never-ending internal struggle in terms of how we express our sexual and aggressive impulses. That's where ego and superego come in. Superego is just as irrational as id, but superego, of course, whereas id says, I want it, get out of my way, I want it right now, I got an itch, I got to scratch it right now. Superego is there with its relentless pursuit of perfection to say, Greg, what are you thinking? You shouldn't even be thinking about doing that, let alone actually doing it. So we would say superego has an irrational, relentless pursuit of perfectionism. It is our part of our personality that puts us on guilt trips, inspires anxiety, and tries to inhibit us from acting out inappropriately on our sexual and aggressive impulses. And it's superego's role in inhibiting us from acting out on our impulses, of course, that forms a core definition of executive function. The most important executive function, the most important thing our brain does, we all have our critical thinking skills. We can design rockets that go to the moon. We can design creative fashions that are demonstrated on the runway. But the most important and least glamorous thing that our brain does for us is stop us from doing things. Okay? We call that inhibition. Not very glamorous, but if we weren't able to inhibit a thought, an emotion, a particular action, well, I'll tell you. Now me, of course, I'm Mr. Low-Tech, Mr. Old School. Ender Options gives me a BlackBerry, but I probably wouldn't have one otherwise, because they're just getting too fancy nowadays for low-tech me. So I'm just breaking in my new BlackBerry. They upgrade us every year or so. Like, that's what I need, is more technology, of course. I'm still trying to figure out the version 3 times ago. Anyway, enough of my intellectual challenges here. I'm on the highway heading home on US 36 toward Broomfield last night, and I thought I saw my light up on my BlackBerry, and I thought I would look at one message, okay? Uh-oh, this sounds like multitasking to me. Oh, they're doing 2 things at once. And of course, driving itself is a complex adventure in multitasking, if we think about it in its own right, because we're keeping in mind lots of different things at the same time, continuously shifting our attention to the road, to our mirror, and in my unfortunate case, my BlackBerry. So, of course, I showed some good executive function, some awareness of my environment. I looked around, there was nobody on the side of the road, no cars, nobody in front, nobody inside, nobody in back, so I'm a good little executive functioner here, until, of course, I tried to get that message on my BlackBerry. And, of course, as I'm doing that, next thing I know, my car's 2 feet off the road. Okay? Hello! Well, yes. Of course, I am the guy who is I was actually getting my keys out of my pocket once when I was walking down a driveway, and I actually slipped and fell. So, I'm glad these darn psychologists aren't giving me tests of multitasking, quite frankly, because I got a feeling I'd personally be bombing out big time. All right, then. Response inhibition. Freud saw it as a function of superego, of course. It was its never-ending quest for truth, justice, and the American way, and the relentless pursuit of morally correct behavior at all times. Not only morally correct behavior, but morally correct thinking. You ever hear the term thought crime? Well, that's Freud 101. Okay? Courtesy of superego's excessive irrational anxiety. Ego's job, of course, ongoing, is to strike up some balance, mediate these ongoing conflicts, because id and superego are always button heads. Okay? Superego doesn't even want to think about sex, let alone do it. And id, that's all it wants to do, any place, any time, with anybody. So needless to say, ego has its hands full. So we would say that ego is what we now call executive function. We, of course, would locate not only ego, but also executive function in these frontmost parts of the brain here. We call these parts of the brain, right in front of the forehead, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex connects via millions of nerve fibers called axons, and those axons are myelinated. That means they have a protein white sheet or coating, so messages move very quickly between the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain that help it do its job in executive function. So this is the seat of executive function here, and of course this would be the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere. This would be the left prefrontal cortex and the right prefrontal cortex. Now, myself, of course, I tried to get into all the Richard Simmons exercise videos back in the day, and my problem was with Richard Simmons, he'd be up dancing around, and that's the extent of my moves, by the way, so don't get your hopes up. Richard Simmons would be doing his thing, and he'd do something with his left hand, and I'm trying to translate that to my left hand, and I'm getting all directionally challenged here, okay? So if there's any kindred spirits like myself out there, I'll turn around, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, okay? Left prefrontal lobe, right prefrontal lobe, okay? All right. The left prefrontal lobe is much more specialized for verbal working memory, verbal problem solving, okay? Verbal decision making. When we're using words, whether we're hearing them or producing them, that's left hemisphere stuff. When we're putting blocks together, of course I brought my blocks today, when we put blocks together, when we step back and get the big picture, we get the gestalt of a situation. Anytime we're doing or thinking visual, spatial images, relationships, we're designing bridges, we're trying to hook up the VCR, or the, of course, I guess we do still have VCRs, don't we? Yes, my goodness. Technology is leaving me in a blur. That's why I had my children, of course, every time we had some new piece of technology at home, I call one of my kids over to set it up for me. Thank God for our children. Verbal, visual, spatial, this side. Okay? Left hemisphere, right hemisphere. We have a process in our brain that helps us keep track of what's going on. Say we're trying to think of 2 or 3 things at the same time, okay? If we're trying to keep track of 2 or 3 verbal things at the same time, that's verbal working memory. And of course, as we keep track of those simultaneously, and then we shift flexibly from one to another, we call that multitasking. But our working memory allows us to keep all 3 of those things in mind at the same time. And that, of course, is happening in this part of the brain here. If we're trying to keep a 3-step direction in mind at the same time, that is being kept in visual working memory right over on the right prefrontal cortex. Okay? We have what goes on in the left hemisphere. Technically, they call that, in terms of verbal working memory, technically they call that a phonological loop. Beats me why. In terms of the right hemisphere, visual working memory, they call that, which makes a little more sense, they call it a sketch pad. Like you might write reminders or a to-do list on a sketch pad, or you might scribble a design or something. That's called a sketch pad. All right. Now, so Freud was early on recognized the importance of the role of inhibition, problem solving, reasoning, conflict. Although Freud had significant insight into the dynamics of the mind, what we now call executive function, in terms of the self-management of our impulses, insight into our actions, and of course the inhibition component with super-ego and ego working together. Then of course the behavioral revolution hit full tilt. Behaviorism, and back from 1970 through 1982, I was probably as radical a behaviorist as ever was created. Okay, in radical behaviorism, psychology lost its mind. Okay.
Wow.
And of course, we had stimulus response theory. So in the presence of a stimulus, a certain response, the response appropriate to that stimulus situation, positive reinforcing stimulus. Now please don't misunderstand. Oops, I'm getting off track again. Good self-checking there, Greg. Don't get me wrong. Although behavioral psychology does not empower personal responsibility, it doesn't recognize free will, it doesn't recognize self-efficacy, personal empowerment. It's not even consistent with personal responsibility from my understanding of it. Applied behavior analysis, as we call it. I was thoroughly trained in applied behavior analysis. We certainly don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We certainly want to recognize the fundamental importance of many behavioral strategies in working with our persons, not only here at Excelsior, but in working with our persons with intellectual disabilities. Persons with impaired executive function. The task is a 500-piece puzzle, okay? Oh my God. I'm getting perceptually overwhelmed just looking at that mess. As you probably have already figured out, I'm a talker, I'm a verbal learner, I'm a guy who likes to talk. So this side of my brain works a whole lot better than that side of my brain, okay? You know what proof I have of that is I have an identical twin who's been my guinea pig over many years. Every time Greg has to learn a new psychological test, well, my long-suffering wife Vicki and my identical twin brother Gary are always my first victims, of course, and they hate me for it. Just kidding. So, persons with executive function issues, and we can call that executive dysfunction, if you will, have problems with organization and management, planning ahead, coming through the process step by step, managing timelines. For a person with significant executive dysfunction, specifically in the visual spatial realm, this just looks like a big mess. It looks like an overwhelming task to plan around, to set goals around, to organize, and to show the persistence to get the darn thing done. Okay? I have had the privilege and pleasure of working with people on the autism spectrum disorder. Do we have kids here on that spectrum? I would imagine we do. I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with kids on the spectrum, and you throw these 500 pieces in front of them, you blink your eyes, you take your eyes off them for a minute, and I know some people who have assembled this 500-piece puzzle just like that. I'm a little hyperbole here, but we all have seen this, okay? Some persons have an organizing plan, they have a strategy. Heck, I've got to find the border pieces, and that makes it a manageable learning task for me, okay? But again, for someone with significant visual spatial inefficiency in their brain like I've got to go with the border here to make this a halfway manageable task.
Yes.
But then, of course, I've got to come up with some goals on how many pieces am I going to put in before I let myself take a break. Do I really care if I finish this darn puzzle? Am I going to stick with it and show that persistence? Okay? It comes easily to some people, but not to all of us, of course. So persons with visual spatial processing issues, executive dysfunction issues, may need support if they can't organize this complex problem-solving process on their own. They benefit from support in terms of some organization. That's where we come up with things like task analysis. We're familiar with task analysis? Task analysis was originated by radical behaviorists who call it a stimulus-response chain. Each stimulus set the occasion for the next response, and reinforce the response that came before it. Okay? So there's a long history of using task analysis to break down a complex process step by step. Okay? Now, if we wanted to teach Greg to tie a tie, okay, there's a couple ways to go about it. I tie what's called a double Windsor. Some men prefer single Windsors. I go with the double because that's what my dad taught me years ago. We can go step by step in a forward direction. Okay? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, etc., etc. Okay? This is a task analysis that goes in a forward direction. First we do steps 1, then steps 1 and 2, 1, 2, and 3, so on and so forth. Okay? That's called forward chaining. That's a tried and true behavioral, applied behavioral teaching technique. That can organize the learning process for persons with executive dysfunction. Another spin is instead of starting with the first step and add a step at a time in the forward direction, forward chaining, step 1, 1 and 2, 1, 2 and 3, etc., etc. We can start at the very last step and work backwards step by step toward the beginning. That is called backward chaining. Where am I in my task analysis here? So, I'm teaching a person with significantly challenged, hi there. We have a packet over there. Yeah, there's some packets over there. Sign in. So, what we do in backward chaining would be to start with the very last step, and like I said, proceed step by step toward the beginning. So, this is the last step, okay? The teacher assists the student to do all but the last step, and all that the student has to do the first time is to do the last response. Yay! And then there's some praise, some self-reinforcement. And of course, although my old man used to tell me, Greg, self-praise stinks, my dad was just kind of that way. I would certainly say to all of us today that self-praise is very empowering, and it's a survival skill. It's an important executive function along with self-talk, because frankly, I'm trying to remember the last time I did something and somebody came up to me and patted me on the back for anything, okay? Now, however, of course, if I forget to get something done, I hear all about that very quickly. So I learned long ago to engage in self-reinforcement for a job well done, okay? So when in our work with our persons, not only do we want to validate their accomplishment, we also want to empower a self-reinforcement as well, a critically important executive function. Okay. So, the student here did the last step, okay? And then you leave a little more of the tie untied, okay? You leave the last 2 steps of the tie untied, so then you've got to put it in here. This always happens. So you leave the last 2 steps undone. So the student would do the last 2 steps, 1 and 2. The last 3 steps, so on and so forth. You leave more and more of the tie untied. You work backwards step by step toward the beginning and will up. Okay? That's backward chaining. And I can only tell you how many times I've used that with like persons with intellectual disabilities, and I'm sure it may find clinical application here in our work with persons. Because again, if our forward chaining goal, our shaping goal is, well, today we're going to get the first 3 pieces done. Oh my God, well, that only leaves 497 pieces to go. Heck with this, I'm out of here. Okay? So there is a logic, particularly on complex, difficult tasks, to start at the end and work backward toward the beginning. Because by definition, starting at the end and working back toward the beginning, you're always successful. You always achieve your goal. Because in other words, if I was doing backward chaining on this puzzle, 499 pieces would be in place. Yay! All I got to do is put the last one in, then the last couple, and then the last three, and then four, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So there is some logic, particularly on tasks that require a lot of planning, organization, and goal-directed persistence to start at the last and work backward toward the beginning. Okay? So we gradually empower and shape increased persistence on difficult tasks. So, again, we certainly appreciate the fundamental organizing principles of applied behavior analysis strategies. I know you do a lot of behavior stuff here in your work with your clients here at Excelsior. Do you have a level system here? Participants go up one level with corresponding privileges and responsibilities, and if they blow it, they go back to the previous level? Yes. I worked with the fellow who came up with that process, Nathan Asman. That's called the token economy. And I worked with him back when I was a student at Southern Illinois. So what we call in terms of a level system where students earn rewards, reinforcers for particular achievements, of course, as we're going to call them targeted behaviors. I'm not sure what you call them here, but the notion is the same. That's a token economy approach that is just a very important contribution from applied behavior analysis. Okay. Questions, comments, discussion on what applied behavior analysis has to offer when persons experience issues with planning, organization, multitasking, in other words, issues with executive function. Discussion, questions, comments. No, you don't. Well, I recall with great fondness at the time, but with great horror now as I hear myself saying this. Of course, I came up through the ranks. I was one of these radical behavioral types, okay? And I was one of these stimulus response guys, and we were going to change the world. We were going to control the external stimulus environment. Well, of course, we fell short in that regard, as you might have predicted. We didn't see it coming, of course, but we certainly fell short of our mark. Then in '67, and I met B.F. Skinner, by the way, back in the day. He was a nice, gracious, generous, warm, genial sort of a guy. He wasn't the monster that some of us might have sketched him out to be. Anyway, a friend of Skinner's, a guy named Goldheim, in '67, starts taking it from the external stimulus environment, in other words, from our external environment, controlling everything, to self-control inside the person. Okay? So if we can get instructed to do something, if we can get reinforced for doing something, if we can get punished for doing something by that stimulus environment outside of us, again, which doesn't empower free will, self-efficacy, or personal responsibility for that matter, Goldheim proposed radical concepts back in '67 called self-instruction, self-reinforcement, self-punishment, thereby putting the locus of control where it belongs, inside the person. Okay? I remember some of the early journal articles, and I don't know, I've read lots of journal articles, written a couple, and they almost just kind of said, yeah, I know that. They kind of confirmed the obvious, okay. Some of the early articles on self-punishment, people used to run around with little rubber bands on the wrist, and every time they make some error, they'd snap themselves with that rubber band. I'm thinking, ouch, that hurts. Let's not do that, Craig. Let's try to be proactive, engage in some proactive self-instruction before we have to end up tweaking ourselves with a rubber band. Mercy. So in '67, the shift started going back inside the person. Psychology regained its mind that it had lost for several decades. Okay? Oh gosh, back in my days when I was studying intro psych, you could go through an entire intro psych text and not see the word brain, except in this way. We called it the black box back in the day. Oh my God. What were we guilty of? Trying for that relentless pursuit of a scientific psychology, we left out the most important part, our brain. Yes, textbooks would show things like stimulus, somewhere between the stimulus and the response. That's where the brain came in. We didn't know exactly what it did. We didn't care because we didn't need it to control people's behavior. Okay? Ooh. That was a black box. Thank goodness we put the brain back in psychology, into our work with persons. Executive function, of course, is at the heart of what the brain does best, and unfortunately, the worst. Example, if I'm working with a person, let's name her Nikki, and we did a big workup, a neuropsych workup with Nikki. And Nikki, because she's in our intellectual disability system, she's a superstar in our system. She gets a full-scale IQ of 79. We, of course, know that's toward the upper end of the borderline range of abilities. It's a miracle that Nikki, of course, was found eligible for intellectual disability services. Okay? Cutoff is kind of around 70 or below. But there's Nikki, and she is a superstar in our intellectual disability community. She lives in the community. She has a 5-year-old daughter. So we're thinking, wow, that IQ of 79, she's looking mighty good. Okay? We predict a smooth sailing for Nikki. Au contraire. Okay? We gave Nikki this test here of concept formation called the booklet category test. And I'll have Cindy administer this to me in just a little bit. I can show off my own issues with executive dysfunction. This is what our clinic uses as one measure of executive dysfunction. We'll explain a little bit. Anyways, there's 208 cards, so you get 208 cracks at it. And Nikki made 97 errors out of 208. So she has a significant impairment in her executive function. We'll abbreviate that EF, executive function. Now, if you had to pick and choose one or the other, which do we think is more predictive of Nikki's real-life abilities? Her really nice-looking full-scale IQ 79, which, you know, for some of, I'm sure some of your girls here, you know, I'm sure you have girls in the intellectual disability range. Is that the case? Yep. And I'm sure you've got girls who are in the very gifted range as well, I'm quite sure. But in our world, our intellectual disability community, Nikki's a superstar. And we're thinking, oh, smooth sailing, she's going to do well. No problem, she can live independently with her 5-year-old little girl, and things are going to go pretty well. Nothing could be farther from the truth, my friends. Nikki has significant issues in managing her affairs and interacting appropriately, consistently with her 5-year-old little girl because of her significant executive function impairments. Okay? So unfortunately, is there a relationship between our intellect and our executive function abilities? Sure. Is it a perfect one-to-one correspondence? No. Particularly if we throw in psychiatric illnesses such as ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar mood disorder, major depression, borderline personality, all of which exert their own significant effects on various aspects of our executive function, such as multitasking and working memory. Okay? So this particular test, and I know I've talked with Michelle Klecker. You know Michelle? Yeah. I know Michelle. She's I'm the training director for a doctoral internship consortium, of which Cindy is a member. Yay! Cindy's from the University of the Rockies down in Springs. And she's doing her internship with me and Beth at Denver Options this year. So I know Michelle from our role as training director for that doctoral internship consortium. And I know she's a consultant, and she, of course, tells me she does some psychological assessments of the girls here, does she?
Yeah.
Yeah. And she, matter of fact, she told me, and I apologize because we didn't number anything. The reason is, of course, because we cobbled this together from about 3 different PowerPoints. If you go probably 10 pages or so in there, there's a page that says Assessing Executive Functioning at Excelsior, Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function, and Brief. Now, we're not talking boxes of briefs here, my friends. We're talking the brief, the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function. Again, I'm sorry to put you on this magical mystery tour here. Any of you familiar with Dr. Kleckler's use of the brief to assess executive function? Okay. Yeah, Michelle told me that she does that rather routinely in her psychological workups. We all there? The brief? Are we all there? Okay. As we see, it's an 86-item questionnaire that looks at critical executive function abilities.
Can you show us what it looks like?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Right here.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Are we all here?
More than 5 pages.
How's that?
There's more than 5 pages.
More than 5 pages? Yeah, I was trying to kind of do that because mine is just printed on one side. My humble apologies, I'm having a meltdown in my own personal executive function here. And I'm, as always, quite embarrassed by it. But we have to carry on. Yes, the organizing effect of putting page numbers on things has been driven home to me quite dramatically here today. We all on the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function. Agree. We look at inhibition, cognitive flexibility, organization, planning, metacognition. Metacognition is when you're able to step back and have some perspective on your own learning process. You know what you know what you don't know, and you have learned how to learn. Those are all aspects of metacognition. Emotional control and initiation. Again, I would bring to our attention inhibition, initiation. Those, again, my friends, the 2 core executive functions. Because without those, without our brain's ability to start, stop, none of the others, cognitive flexibility certainly goes right out the window, for example. Because we would show some brain-related perseveration that we can see, for example, in persons with obsessive compulsive disorder, or traumatic brain injury, or in psychosis, or in bipolar mood disorder. People with bipolar mood disorder can look pretty compulsive. Certainly persons with paranoid schizophrenia can look more than a little compulsive. Okay? All right. Examples of the brief questions: forgets to hand in homework even when completed, gets caught up in details and misses the big picture, becomes overwhelmed by large assignments, underestimates the time needed to finish tasks. Those all look like academic skills, don't they? Well, they are. A lot of research shows that successful students are successful because they are able to self-manage their learning process through skillful executive function abilities. Okay? If a student is not able to self-manage his or her learning process, okay, given teacher shortages, funding cutbacks, that sort of thing, that student is at risk to get behind, to fall through the cracks, to crash and burn, to melt down academically and perhaps socially as well. Whether it's in the classroom or out in the playground, if you're not able to self-manage your stuff, both in class and out in the playground, you're going to crash and burn. Okay? All right. My son Adam teaches 5th grade at a local school district. And I was, Adam has our 8-year-old grandson Elijah, and we went up to Flat Top, mountain up in Rocky Mountain National Park on Sunday. It's 12,300 feet, and this was Eli's first big hike up to the top of the mountain. He's got ADHD, he's on guanfacine or Tenix. You're also seeing that marketed as Intuit on the TV commercials nowadays. Guanfacine or Tenix has been a real good ADHD med for Eli, lots better than the psychostimulants. He got really ticky, like tics. Got really ticky on things like Concerta, for example, and Adderall, but has been able to tolerate the guanfacine or Tenix really quite well. So it's been a good help for him. Elijah is a runner. He ran Boulder without stopping, which is a whole lot better than Grandpa can lay claim to, trust me. So he's got the energy, he's got the moves, he's got the goal-directed persistence that sometimes we don't see in kids with ADHD. So it's a 9.5-mile round-trip hike. Old Elijah was right there leading the way, and he led me and Dad up the mountain. And I'll tell you, my friends, it was 75 down here, but it looked more like winter up there, so we got an early exposure to winter. Of course, winter's my favorite time of year, so it felt good for me. So on the hike up to Flat Top, I'm asking my son, the 5th grade teacher, Adam, I know, of course, I know you're teaching more and more to the test, son. And then my son says a few choice words, of course, outside of earshot of 8-year-old Elijah, indicating his, of course, just his issues with what teachers have to teach now. We teach to the test. We've got to pass those Septs for, obviously for continued funding from the state and for continued acknowledgement, validation of teacher abilities, for promotions, for tenure, all this and all that. So after those choice words, we started talking a little about executive function. And I said, hey, son, you ever hear the word executive function? He says, yeah, Dad, I think I heard of it. Is it in your curriculum at your school with the 5th graders? Because that's prime time, of course, to work on lots of really important executive function skills like being able to write a term paper. And of course, we write term papers that interesting content. I mean, we acquire some knowledge, but it's also a good exercise in executive function because there's a lot of steps, critically important executive function stuff goes on in writing a term paper. Okay? Number 1, coming up with a topic, planning, staying on task, being able to inhibit, driving the train off the tracks and getting derailed and losing interest in your topic or shifting gears and changing your topic midstream after you put in 20 hours of work. Say, this is boring, I'm going to do something different. So a lot of good stuff with self-monitoring, checking, of course. And me, I've got more than a touch of OCD in my personality functioning, thank you, which my wife will point out, of course, as I am, taking her dish to the dishwasher after she's done with it. Oops! I hate it when I do that. Here we go. I've left my rubber band at home today. So self-checking, self-monitoring come easy to a guy like me. I'm always checking myself, okay? Every time I score a psychological assessment, I don't go over it once, I go over it twice to make sure I didn't make any errors. So that comes really easily to me, okay? So self-monitoring, checking, planning, organization, goal-directed persistence, all important 5th grade executive functions. Okay? So I say, Adam, is executive function, are those process skills part of the curriculum? Because I know everyone's caught up now in the product, in the result. In other words, the score on the achievement test. Okay? So we've lost sight of the process. And the process in self-management, our behavior in a clinical setting, in real life, in adaptive living, the process of self-management in our school setting is executive function. Okay? Those are the core skills that need to be explicitly taught so our students can self-manage their mood, their behavior, their thinking, their interpersonal interactions, and their academic performance. So the short answer to that question, and I'm keeping all my fingers and toes crossed, that there is going to be some formal process orientation, formal recognition of process in his school system, which turns out some of the highest achieving kids in the whole state. He says, no, Dad, We don't look at that process stuff systematically. We don't explicitly teach executive function skills. Kids pick them up, oh yeah, sure. We model them sometimes. But it's not like there's a formal curriculum to teach all these important aspects of executive function, the underlying process in self-management, planning, goal setting, self-regulation, resisting, being able to inhibit distractions, and sticking with it. All that important executive function stuff is not explicitly taught as process in his school system, which is one of the highest achievement indicators. And of course, I was disconcerted to hear him say that, but unfortunately not surprised. Yeah.
2 pages before that slide he was talking about, Dr. Thaler has a developmental chart listing the ages of what executive skills should be expected.
And of course, then there's my 28-year-old son, Mark. Of course, who's still working on his own executive functioning curve in terms of the self-management of his life. Okay? We see, of course, that this frontmost part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is the slowest to develop, and it continues to develop well into our 20s. I would certainly say that my son is a living example of that. In terms of his decision-making, some tendency toward risk-taking, impulsivity. He's one of these skier guys. He's a ski bum. He's a lifty up at Snowmass, and he lives to ski. And of course, oops, sometimes he forgets to put on his helmet, and then he crashes into a tree and gets a concussion. Oh, that's my son, Mark. Okay? And we know, of course, about the effects that traumatic brain injuries such as concussion, skull fracture have on our kids. I'm sure we have a number of our kids here with some aspect of impaired brain function secondary to a traumatic brain injury. Is that the case? I'm not making this up, am I? I didn't think so. In my work with persons with intellectual disabilities at Denver Options, sure our clients have, most of them have mild mental retardation, an IQ of 50 to 55 to 70. But when there is psychiatric illness, such as ADHD, which there often is a mood disorder, when we see people on our behavior assessment clinic at Denver Options, in other words, those are people we know or suspect of having psychiatric issues, a full 25% of our persons have post-traumatic stress disorder. A full 10% have issues with substance abuse, 10% ADHD, 25% a mood disorder such as major depression or bipolar disorder. Again, just so we rapidly shift gears here, our persons with intellectual disabilities, those of you who hang out with persons with ID and know them, they're not always happy campers, are they? Far from it. Okay? I would say that life is tough enough when your brain is intact, when you have intact executive functioning, when there's no significant brain-related or neuropsychological impact in your brain. We got intact brains, and life's tough enough as it is, my friends. We all know this to be true. Okay? I had 6 major potential challenges and compromises to my plan for today to get over here at 2 o'clock. I mean, things came up. Just kind of because life, you know what I mean? My 28-year-old son Mark headed out to Indiana. He's the best man at his buddy PJ's wedding. And of course, Dad, if that'd be me, in his compulsive nature, puts the proof of insurance cards not in the glove box, in the wallet, of course. So I had to end up scanning a proof of insurance card to Mark on his iPhone today as he's heading out of town. So just little, we all have our challenges, our little executive function, working memory breakdowns. If I would have task analyzed that situation and said, okay, this is everything I need to have ready so Mark can take my car to Indiana this morning, well, proof of insurance probably would have been at the top of the list, but oops, I was too busy hiding in my pocket. I've got a relatively intact brain. Well, I'm turning 60 next Friday. But the effects of aging on brain function, well, that's a whole nother presentation, I guess. I would certainly say that I'm not nearly as sharp mentally as I used to be, and thank God I did my doctorate when I was more intact. I can't imagine going back to school now. Oh my God. My wife says, Vicki, she says, hey Greg, psychiatrists make a lot more money. Why don't you go to medical school? Right? I'll get back with you on that one. Oh my God, is my typical response. Our persons with intellectual disabilities, and we, of course, they are among us here as well, do not have intact neuropsychological, in other words, brain function. They have significant impairments in executive function. And, you know, we know how traumatic brain injury, TBI, works. You can take a nasty blow to the back of the head, and where does it end up? Right in the front part of the brain. We know what we call that contre coup, of course. Hits you in the back, and it ends up impairing prefrontal lobe function all the way up front. There's a big shock wave. You get a hit back here. Next thing you know, that shock wave is extended all the way to the front of your brain and impaired your prefrontal lobe function, either temporarily or more permanently, of course. So when our persons with ID and our persons here, when they have our clients, of course, intellectual disability, they have a psychiatric disorder which further impairs their executive function, their decision making, their choices, their problem solving. Then throw traumatic brain injury on top of that, of course, that's a triple whammy, my friends. And those are the persons Cindy and I spend a lot of our time with, trying to structure external support and structure with. It's axiomatic that the more significantly impaired a person's executive function, in other words, their ability to self-manage aspects of their mental, emotional, and behavioral life, their everyday learning of adaptive living skills, the more impaired that is, the more external support and structure they need. We, of course, saw in your brochure safety, security, and success or is it structure? Safety, structure, was it? What did your brochure say? Oh, what's that say? Yes, safety, structure, and success. We know about structure, don't we, my friends? Our girls here, our kids with ID, they need structure. Okay? Kids with ADHD, kids with traumatic brain injury, unstable mood, borderline stuff, bipolar stuff, they are literally screaming out for external support and structure. We can. And of course, they are screaming out for it, sometimes literally, as we're well aware. And of course, those are often the persons who are the least receptive or the least up for accepting that external support and structure. Okay. Questions, comments, discussion at this point?
Do you know if you're saying from a TBI, what about just lack of oxygen to the brain when, like, during childbirth? Has that been looked at all?
We call that hypoxia. Yeah. Okay. That's a more or less generalized deprivation of oxygen to the brain at some point. I don't know, I woke up to the news this morning and there was some little 12-year-old kid, I guess, who had he drowned or something, or was underwater for, 20-some minutes or so. Hadn't breathed for 20-some minutes, and he, of course, was in the process of relearning, understanding the sort of walk and talk, that sort of thing. My heart goes out to that little guy because, you know, you don't have any oxygen to the brain, you're breathing for 20 minutes. He suffered significant hypoxia, and although I'm sure he's getting intensive OT, PT, speech and language, cognitive rehab therapy as well. It remains to be seen, I guess, how long-lasting his brain-related or neuropsychological impairments will last. Yeah, certainly hypoxia, generalized lack of oxygen to the brain, can result in executive function, neuropsychological impairments, all the way from virtually non-existent to quite severe, depending upon a number of factors. Sometimes one region of the brain is damaged, another can compensate and take over its job, for example. But hypoxia, even if you spend a lot of time like my son Mark does, you know, he's the 28-year-old that I was lamenting about, of course. He's had a couple of concussions because he didn't wear his helmet skiing. Mark also, of course, climbs our 14,000-foot peaks here in Colorado. He's been up 47 out of the 54, and he literally scares the bejesus out of me every time I go up with him. Oh my God, I can't believe we're on this ridge. Oh no, I'm not going to look down. Oh my God. Oh geez. There goes my blood pressure. I'm glad I took my atenolol this morning because it just skyrocketed. Mark routinely puts himself in those kind of situations. Okay? So even if you spend a lot of time here in Colorado at high altitude, you can get high altitude hypoxia. So if you're a climber, get used to it, my friends, because there's a lot less oxygen up at 14,000 feet, certainly at 20,000 feet when you went down to Mexico than there is down here at 5280. Okay? And research studies with this high altitude hypoxia. I mean, you guys got veteran climbers who they do all the neuropsych tests on that we do with our persons, and they show some neuropsych impairment on testing, okay, because of high altitude hypoxia. Because the air is verified, and the air is definitely thinner up there, particularly 17,000 feet and above. Particularly when our 8-year-old grandson with ADHD Elijah, he's second wind, of course, as we get into the summit. We're only 12th grade. And Adam says, well, Eli, welcome to the world of 12,000 feet, because breathing isn't nearly as easy up here as it is at home. All right. Well, where are we? Let's do this before I talk our entire 2 hours away here. Let's get this out. It's on the right side of our packet. Executive skills questionnaire for Sept. And if you'd like to take the time, if you have any issues with your executive function personally, Form 3 months is significant skills plan intervention. You can do an intervention for yourself if you're so inclined. I highly recommend passing on that aspect of the situation, though, because then we have to do something about it now, wouldn't we? Executive skills questionnaire, it's on the right side there. We all have it. It's 2 pages. Follow the instructions at the top. Big problem 1, no problem 5. Are we there?
Yeah.
Okay, do this from your chairs, please. And there's a page there's a page 185 and 186. Add up the total score for each of those areas, and then see what each of the items means in terms of executive function. And then you can identify your executive skills, strengths, or weaknesses, which I prefer to call inefficiencies. Again, 1 to 5 for each item, 1 big problem. Not that any of us have any of those issues, and 5 no problem. I'm sure we're all going to have no problems with all of these things. Well done? Okay. Well, I'm pleased to announce, of course, that Megan, another intern at Denver Options, came along today, and little did she realize when she tagged along today that she was going to be put on the spot and serve as our show in the audience, and Megan is going to share the results of her self-assessment of her executive function abilities. Why don't you go ahead, Megan?
Okay, so for my strengths, I had organization as my strongest, which doesn't surprise me in the slightest. And then I had a 3-way tie between work and memory, planning and prioritization, and goal-directed persistence. And it's almost embarrassing how much I knew kind of ahead of time that would be my strengths. And then my weaknesses, I had emotional control, response inhibition, and flexibility. And again, I could completely see that coming.
Okay, thank you. Questions, comments, discussion about our self-assessment of our personal executive function abilities? I hope this has been some fun. Self-assessment, of course, is the starting point for personal growth and development. And I certainly have filled this out, and I certainly have things to work on as well. Well, lest I talk our entire time away, and of course I could be more than happy doing that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Cindy, who's going to look at the effects that various psychiatric disorders have on our executive functioning.
Now, unlike Greg, I am much more of a visual learner, and so that's the way that I teach. And so we will be using the slides that I created for that, and some that Greg already had. So if you want to turn in your packets, it's probably about midway to this little pie chart here, and ADHD core symptoms. So I guess we complement each other using different types of areas.
Yes, we sure do.
Everyone there? Almost? I think we will both come up.
We sure will.
So this breaks down the core symptoms of ADHD and talks about the different areas of the brain that control these areas. So as you probably know, as ADHD, the biggest problem with that is inattention. And so we have it divided into selective attention and sustained attention, for which different parts of the brain are responsible. But they are all related to the executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex that Dr. Thaler talked about earlier. I refer to him as Dr. Thaler as my supervisor. So. And another piece, of course, of ADHD is the hyperactivity, and that's controlled in the prefrontal motor cortex, which makes sense as that controls all of our movement. And then impulsive symptoms, that again has to do with an inability to inhibit certain behaviors. And that's in the orbital frontal cortex, which is just right here behind your eyes. And so the medication that's given oftentimes for ADHD are stimulants, which seems to not make a lot of sense, because you think stimulants are going to make more hyper and active and inattentive. But what it actually does is it activates those neurotransmitters that aren't working as well to help with the impulse control and help with attention and so forth. And so that's why they're given stimulants to activate those areas in the brains. So, and then on the next page there is a nice little graph of how the symptoms manifest across the developmental stages. As you can see in preschool, where impulsivity and hyperactivity are at its peak, but as we age out, and of course, once you have ADHD, usually many adults weren't identified as children and do have it. And so inattention seems to stay pretty stable across the lifespan. But the impulsivity and hyperactivity start to reduce. That's what that shows. And so some of the research I looked at, Dr. Thaler asked me to look at some of the more recent research on how these different psychiatric disorders impact executive functioning. So I just went back in the last year, so this is all very current. In one study, they found they actually compared children who had just ADHD to children who had ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. And interestingly, they found, of course, both groups had some deficits in executive functioning, which are listed here. But then the children who also had ODD or oppositional defiant disorder showed additional symptoms as reported by their parents on the brief, which Dr. Thaler has already gone over with you. So they had more problems of inhibition, shifting, which means being able to move from one task to another, and emotional control, which are all, again, executive functions. They also, I think this was another study that I read, they compared, as you may know, ADHD has different types. You have predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, and then you have combined, where the kids are both inattentive and hyperactive. And it was found that the kids who were combined had more problems than the kids with just the predominantly inattentive type. So you guys have probably seen this with the girls that you're working with. You see them having both symptoms, then it's definitely more difficult for them. So one of the studies I found, they looked at introducing if-then plans to boys with ADHD, which I imagine can generalize to girls. I'll have to find another study or create one to look specifically at girls. But if-then plans are basically giving them a task with the basic instructions, but adding, if this should happen, then do this. So preparing them for any changes that may come up with the specific task. I think on here we talked about the math one. There were 2 studies. But in the math one, they presented math problems at the top of their screen, and then they sometimes had the movie Shrek just pop up as a distractor to see how that would impact their attention. And they found that with the kids where they made the plan, if Shrek comes on, then plan to ignore it and plan to keep doing your best to focus on the math problems. And they found that that had quite a significant impact on their performance. And they found that the boys who had these plans in place, the if-then plans, performed just as well as the boys without ADHD. So I thought that was pretty significant. So preparing kids ahead of time for, this is what may come up, and let's plan now what we should do. So that seemed to help. The same thing was found with another task where they did card sorting, which is an executive function test, organizing things. Again, it was if the rule changes, then you change the rule to go along with it. So, which we see in the booklet category test as well. So, and then the next several slides talk quite a bit about PTSD. There's several of them, so I'm not going to go into big detail with them. Talks about how with PTSD, they're classically conditioned to fear stimulus that otherwise wouldn't have caused them to have a reaction. As you know, with PTSD, you have a hyperarousal and the startle response to things that most people aren't afraid of. And so that just talks about that. And then goes a little bit into the neurotransmitters that are released and how they impact different areas of the brain. As you know, at PTSD, it doesn't just impact the prefrontal cortex, it's like the whole brain is involved. The amygdala, which is kind of what I call the fear center. A lot of the memories become associated with fear, and it doesn't move over to the hippocampus until they get some kind of treatment and can work through that. I don't know if you want to add anything on those specific slides. Did you go there? Okay. So there's also some about the high cortisol levels impacting the amygdala as well, which can impair working memory, which again is an executive function. And then I have some more information on that as well. There's attention deficits that are common in PTSD. It's associated with overall lower IQ scores. Verbal IQ is also impacted. Perceptive thinking, which is where you just kind of get stuck on something and can't let it go. Memory acquisition, memory is impacted probably the most with PTSD. And so I think Dr. Thaler had a case study he wanted to discuss related to that.
That's not the first time I've almost done that. I was in 8th grade. I'm trauma memory time, of course. See how those triggers work? Well, I'll tell you. Back in 8th grade, I'm on the stage back at Edinburgh High School, and I'm in the stage play, the Gilbert and Sullivan stage play, the Mikado, and I am a coolie. I'm carrying an umbrella behind the emperor, okay? And we're walking under a trellis, and my umbrella catches a trellis. And of course, I literally brought the show down, of course. The trellis falls on me, my identical twin brother, and the Mikado, of course, who in feudal Japan would have promptly off of my head. Thank God it was just back in Dillard, Michigan. It's amazing how associational learning works and how quickly something like that can trigger a memory from 45 years ago. Thank you very much, Craig, already. All right. See how quickly I got there, too? And that's, of course, how it is with external and internal triggers that we see in our persons with post-traumatic stress disorder. Something triggers an association of memory, and boom, just like you saw me being in the stage play back in 8th grade, our kids are right there real quick. Now, this is from Wexler Memory Scale. I'm going to read a story. Let's see how good we are at recalling the details from it, okay? We all set? Got our listening ears on? Oh, you can tell who I hang out with, can't you? Oh, my. Got 10 grandkids. Ready? Here we go. Anna Thompson of South Boston, employed as a cook in a school cafeteria, reported at the police station that she had been held up on State Street the night before and robbed of $56. She had 4 small children, the rent was due, and they had not eaten for 2 days. The police, touched by the woman's story, took up a collection for her. Okay, let's hear it, my friends. Let's hear some details of that story I just read to you.
4 children.
Yep.
$56.
Thank you.
Boston,
I'm sorry?
South Boston.
South Boston, good. State Street?
Took up a collection.
Took up a collection.
She's a cook.
She's a cook. At a school?
Denise,
What's that?
Denise, 2 days.
Thank you. Brent was due. Oh, yes, indeed. Anything else we remember?
Anna Thompson.
Anna Thompson, all righty. Well, we're doing good.
4 children.
4 children. Our persons with intellectual disabilities, we read them that story. We remember about 2 or 3 out of those 25 details. Okay? Imagine a situation when you're in a short conversation and 90% of what you hear goes in one ear and out the other. That does not produce a lot of personal empowerment. Okay? And of course, there's more stories. There always are. Us docs always have tricks up our sleeves. There's always more stories, more word lists. My God, the list is endless. And then, of course, we have to remember the same stories, more lists, 20 to 30 minutes later as well, of course. Now, if one of our persons remembers 15, 20% out of the gate, they may not remember a single darn thing 20 to 30 minutes later, okay? When it's a free recall, and we say, okay, just tell me what you remember. That's free recall. No cues, no hints, no nothing. Then, however, if we give them hints, most of our persons do lots better. Why? Persons with significant compromises in prefrontal lobe function, involving short-term memory, working memory, when you don't give them any cues to trigger memory, they usually bomb out, not only immediately, but after even a short delay as short as 20 or 30 minutes. However, if you give them recognition cues to persons with significant prefrontal lobe issues, they do lots better. We evaluated the guy, Darren, did a neuropsych on him, and without any cues, he remembers 18% of those stories I just read to you. That's 4 or 5 details out of 25. When at delay, after 25 minutes, we gave him cues, went up from 80 to 70%. He remembers 38% of 12 word pairs, like apple, orange, truck, arrow, that sort of thing, word pairs. 38% right away. When we give him cues, 30 minutes later, he aces at 100% with cues. Word lists. Oops, 0% immediate memory. 30 minutes later, delayed recognition cues, 92%. Darren, unfortunately, illustrates the significant impairments in free recall memory that we can see with prefrontal lobe impairment, and he demonstrates the clear benefit of cues to trigger his memory after a delay. So our persons aren't always going to be able to pull a name or something out of their hat. They may benefit from some cue to trigger that recall. We made reference to, if you saw Darren up there, I'm going to bring out that Trails A, Trails B. It's on the right side of your packet there. We'll take a few minutes to do this. You all got Trails A there? Trails A? Okay. let's get out your trusty pencils here. You on the sample? Trails A sample? Are you there? Okay. This is the sample. Start with your task is to connect the numbers in order 1 to 2, draw a line from 1 to 2, a line from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, etc. As quickly as you can without making any mistakes. And if you make a mistake, go back to where you were last correct. We all do it, did we? Okay. We all there? Let's flip the page over. Oh, there's a few more there. Start on 1, 1, 2, 3, quickly as you can. If you make an error, go back to where you're last correct and start from that point.
You're doing so many Sudokus, this is kind of interesting.
I actually had to give those up for a while. I'm reading a book on the Civil War. I was kind of getting the Sudoku burnout there. I did those for months in a row, and I just kind of said, okay, something new. We get there 1 through 25?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Trails A, of course, is a sequencing task. Sequencing, even on rote things that we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. Whoa! I see how quick I did that. I don't think I left any out. And Darren, you probably took 30 seconds or less. Darren took over 2 minutes and made a couple of errors. This is a guy in the mild range of intellectual disability. It's not that he doesn't know his numbers from 1 to 25 either, or that he can't read them. Okay? Even processing, even planning, getting organized, being able to use self-talk to talk himself through, being able to keep the concept in mind, like, okay, I go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. He got stuck, he made errors. He jumped around, went from 6 to 8. I mean, persons with intellectual disabilities, with executive function impairments, make these sorts of routine errors all the time. Not only on the trail making test, but in real life as well. Okay? If these darn tests didn't illustrate the sort of errors a person can make in real life, I wouldn't waste the person's time giving them in the first place. Okay? All right, let's get Trails B. Trails A is a setup of Trails B, by the way. You'll see why. We all on sample Trails B? Are we all there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. We see numbers and letters, a two-dimension task this time, don't we, my friends? Your task is to go from 1A, 2B, 3C. Alternate number and letter in order. 1A, 2B, 3C. The concept, 1A, 2B, 3C. Are we all there?
Yeah.
Okay. We all get to the sample? Yay! All right. Any issue with that? 1A, 2B, 3C. Let's flip her over. 1A, 2B, 3C until you get to the end. If you make a mistake, go back to where you were last correct and start from that point. 1A, 2B, 3C. Executive functioning is a beautiful thing. Lest I inject a little interference, Trails A and B is a routine part of our neuropsych evals that we do with our persons with intellectual disabilities, and it's pretty much a part and parcel of any neuropsych eval to look at multitasking. Are we all done with Trails B, my friends?
Oh, wait.
Yay! All right. Well, why did we even bother with Trails A? Well, it was a setup to provide interference. We make it perseverate and go from one number to the next number to the next number. So Trails A sets us up to screw up on Trails B, because just when we got used to going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., now we have to shift between number, letter. Shift, yes indeed, shift, an important executive function skill, my friends. We shift gears, we shift our attention. We have to multitask. Multiple stimuli, of course, keep them in mind. We alternate between number, letter. We do self-talk. Oh, gee, what did I just do, Greg? Was it a number or a letter? Okay. We will see our persons, and with our persons with intellectual disability, they often routinely out loud talk themselves through their performance on a task like this. Self-talk is a critically important executive function skill. Darren, the fellow that we saw the benefit of recognition cues for delayed memory when recall wasn't cut the mustard. He did Trails A in a little over 2 minutes, and we're looking for, well, it would have been nice if he had been 30 seconds or less, because that's where we are. Trails B, you should get about double the time, so if it takes you 30 seconds on A, it takes you about a minute on B. Because of that multitasking, alternating the mental set, shifting attention component. So Darren gets 2 minutes or so on Trails A. Oops, 11 and a half minutes on Trails B, my friends. It was difficult to watch him struggle. He made 10 errors, which is really bombing out. And every time someone makes an error, as a psychologist, we have to go back and direct them to where they were last correct and do a little kind of refresher course on what comes next and that sort of thing. And even with that external support of the structure, with impaired multitasking, with impaired executive function, he bombed out. Okay? Should have taken him 4 minutes, it took him 11 and a half minutes. And those are the sort of issues that we see on paper. Darren shows those same issues in real life as well, my friend. Okay? All right.
If you go to the next couple of pages, it talks specifically about what happens to children when they're exposed to trauma as young children, what impact the cortisol, those high cortisol levels can have on the developing brain. So I'm not going to go over all of that. It's there for you to read through. It doesn't have to be enough trauma that they develop PTSD. One of the studies that I found compared children who had witnessed domestic violence. They compared children all of the children had witnessed it, and half of them had developed PTSD as a result, half did not. And they found that both groups of children have the same impact on their executive functioning. Of course, the kids with PTSD had some more severe dysfunction with their executive abilities, but otherwise, for the most part, they both suffered some damage to their executive functioning. So any type of exposure to trauma can really hurt our little kids. And so on the next page there, I do talk about the impact of treatment for PTSD on executive functioning. And in this particular study, they just looked at cognitive behavior therapy, cognitive processing, and prolonged exposure, and found that after, I think it was 10 sessions on average, that they showed improvement on executive functioning using a lot of these measures that we're giving you as examples here, that they did show significant improvement. And I imagine that any sort of treatment that looks to reduce symptoms of PTSD and increase coping is going to have that same positive impact. So I know that you guys use some EMDR here as well. So I believe that any treatment where the aim is to reduce symptoms will have a positive impact on the executive functioning. So I have that there. And then we go on to look at psychosis, and that includes all of the the different disorders that fall under that umbrella: psychosis with a schizophrenia, delusional disorder, a mood disorder with psychotic symptoms. I found a study specifically targeting young people, children and adolescents 7 to 17, who were hospitalized with their first episode, their psychotic episode, and found these impacts on their executive functioning, selective attention, working memory, and verbal memory were all impacted. And this is with the first episode. And as you know, usually there's more to come. I also found some information on major depressive disorder. And one of the things they found with that, which wasn't found as much with the other disorders, psychiatric disorders, was an impact on theory of mind. And what theory of mind is the ability to read another person, to understand what someone else might be feeling, or what thought processes they may have. And so on some theory of mind tests, they found that they were severely impacted with that, which is also another executive function, as well as memory and attention. And some of the other studies that I found, looking at young adults, 16 to 32, I was like, oh, she's still a young adult at 32. With either major depressive disorder or bipolar disorder, which falls under the mood disorders, also had some problems with their executive functioning. And then they also looked at a group of unmedicated patients, so individuals who weren't being treated with medication for these disorders, and found that they had poor performance compared to the control group, even more so than the groups that were being treated. So, impact of treatment. One study that I found, it wasn't specifically a treatment model per se, like CBT or DBT or something like that. But what they found was that when you help a person with depression to organize the incoming data, the incoming information, if you help provide that structure for them and organize it for them, that they actually do better on cognitive tasks. Because they lack that ability to organize the information that's coming in. In this particular study, they presented lists of words and asked them to memorize them. And with one group, they presented them randomly. The other, they actually organized the words for them. They clustered them, or categorized them, and found that that the people who had that, who were depressed, did a lot better when it came to the verbal memory. And then another study that actually did treat the symptoms themselves of depression. After 6 months, they did still find that there were residual effects on their executive functioning. So something like depression can have a long-term impact on individuals. So as much help as they can get, the better it is for them. Then I had some more stuff on bipolar. I guess the one I want to point out on that was they found that as the number of manic episodes increased, there was more of an impact on their executive functioning. So if you actually read over that, you'll see that the patients with only one manic episode had their working memory was impacted, but that was it. And as you read down, you'll see that huge long paragraph once they get to 3 or more episodes of manic episodes. And so treatment for that is pretty critical, avoiding any manic episodes for that. I did find another study on pediatric bipolar disorder, where the treatment of choice for bipolar is usually medication or mood stabilizer. So this particular one, they give a mood stabilizer, and I know that's really hard to give children a mood stabilizer, but if it helps them, it's what you need. But after 14 weeks of treatment, their executive functioning showed significant improvements. So, and then I have some on borderline. I'll let you guys read through that. Looks like we're running out of time. Substance abuse and eating disorders. All of those have impact. I had a little bit of traumatic brain injury, even going back 10 years prior. It can still continue to impact one and no functioning. So, let's go through that. Do you guys have any questions on any of that?
I have a question in terms of the clinical work. What do you think is the best approach in terms of family therapy? I kind of understood what I should do in individual, but family seems to be more of a challenge. And I know we don't have much time left, but if you could address it, that would be helpful.
Family therapy, say, in terms of a treatment approach? And what treatment model do you typically employ with family therapy? What treatment model do you employ?
Well, I'm pretty much, I went to school some time ago and it was pretty Freudian, but pretty much family systems, and I have very much families involved with the kids that I work with. I think sometimes I've noticed obviously a frustration with the parents when the kids aren't making the progress or not understanding cause and effect, or they're ready to, that's done, that's over, that's an hour ago, that kind of thing. And the parent obviously is concerned about that.
Oh, yes.
And I would like to know what you think is a good approach from your experience.
I certainly use a systems approach in marriage and family work. Although I certainly think that there's always it's always good to honor the contributions of other schools. Obviously, you do some person-centered stuff. You do some behavioral stuff. So in terms of skill building, that sort of thing. So I guess when although certainly I guess my basis would be systems. Obviously, you integrate everything that you know when you work with a family with very troubling issues. So yeah, I start with systems and then kind of integrate other approaches. Basically, is what I find myself doing.
I would try to generalize what you're doing here with the kids as far as structure and organization goes, to their family, to their home, working with the parents to provide that for their kids as well. I think that chart that I pointed out with the developmental tasks where they should be, that could be a starting point as far as, this is what you should expect your child to do, and let's work on how to get them there, with reinforcements or whatever. Just working with the individual kids and their families and the way they
What have you seen with the potential improvement when there's a traumatic brain injury involved with the executive functioning? Have you seen learned improvements, considering the fact that there's the disability with the learning factor? Or is it just basically at that point a maintaining of a level?
Most
It's probably very individual.
certainly, but in general, most recovery from traumatic brain injury occurs over a 2-year period, with OT, PT, speech and language, and cognitive rehab. Most of that recovery occurs over a two-year period, and after that, any recovery of abilities is much more difficult to achieve. That, of course, obviously we need to try to remediate any executive function issues and providing, external supports and structure, looking at accommodations and modifications, in addition to skill building. Well, I think, do you leave your certificate of completion on the table there, I guess? Sign your name, and thank you all for your attention and for your participation.
Thank you.